Let's take a look here at the 2011 Macro FRQ. We're going to look at question number 3. It's going to be a bank balance sheet question. Okay, there it is. Sewell Bank has the simplified balance sheet below. So there you see the assets and liabilities, bank T chart. Okay, so let's go to question A. And the key thing to know about these, right? Assets and liabilities are always going to be equal to each other, right? So if you added up all these in this column over here, you should get the same answer over here, right? It's going to balance assets and liabilities. All right, part A. Based on Sewell Bank's balance sheet, calculate the required reserve ratio. Okay, so we look at the balance sheet as it is. This one happens to give us the category required reserves. So the formula for the reserve ratio is required reserves over demand deposits. Okay, so they give us this number here, 2,000, and then our demand deposits are 10,000. Okay, so our reserve ratio is 20%. Okay, pretty straightforward calculation there. You just have to know what you need to, which categories. And it's always going to be required over demand deposits. All right, let's go to part B. Suppose the Federal Reserve purchases $5,000 worth of bonds from Sewell Bank. What will be the change in the dollar value of each of the following immediately after the purchase? Excess reserves and then demand deposits. All right, so anytime we do a transaction to the balance sheet, remember we gotta, let's leave that, they have to balance. I think it's worthwhile just to sort of update and redraw the balance sheet. Okay, so and then based upon this transaction, so we got the Federal Reserve purchases 5,000 worth of bonds from Sewell Bank. Okay, so that means we're doing something over here, changing around these numbers. So government securities, so they have parentheses here, bonds. All right, the Federal Reserve is buying these bonds, right, $5,000 worth. So this number is 2,000, right? We sold 5,000, so we got to subtract 5,000 out of there. All right, now you have to balance this, right? Nothing's going on over here. Demand deposits didn't change, right? It was just the Federal Reserve transacting with the bank itself, right? So 5,000 went from government securities to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve has to pay 5,000 for those securities, right? So our required reserves are already good, right? We have the 20%. So what's going to happen is that excess cash is going to go straight into excess reserves. Okay, so really all that happened here in the assets, we changed the composition of our assets, right? We moved 5,000 from bonds and securities to what's essentially a cash excess reserves because of this transaction, right? So if you added these up, right, this side's still 20,000 and this side should still be 20,000, right? Because all we did is went 5,000 here, subtracted, and then added here. So it just changes the composition on this side. So both sides still balance. We should be good. Now we can answer this question. Okay, part one, what happens to excess reserves? Well, we just said that's going to increase by 5,000. So that cash that the Federal Reserve paid is going to go straight into that category. Now, they ask here about demand deposits. So we can tell based on what we did there that there's no change, right? So I think the common mistake would be, oh, if this went up by 5,000, I need to change this side. Well, no, the composition over here changed and these still balance. So you don't need to do anything over here. So there's no change in demand deposits in this case. All right, part C, calculate the maximum amount that the money supply can change as a result of $5,000 purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve. Okay, so you should have a clue there. We need to calculate the money multiplier for this one. So that is 1 over the reserve ratio. In this case, we said it was 20%, so 0.2. So the money multiplier is going to be 5. Now, we had $5,000 in this transaction go straight into excess reserves. So the bank, Sewell Bank, does not need to put any of that into its required reserves, because required reserves are still taken care of up here, right? That's still 20%. So essentially, it can lend out all of this $5,000 from that transaction with the Fed. So we're going to take the money multiplier, which is 5, we just calculated, and multiply that times the $5,000 amount, and we're going to get a change in the money supply of $25,000. All right, let's go to part D. When the Federal Reserve purchases bonds, what will happen to the price of bonds in the open market? All right, so remember, price and interest rates, price of bonds, that is, are inverse, right? So if one goes up, then the other is going down, or vice versa, right? If the other one's going up, then the other one's going down. They don't move in the same direction. So we need to know here what's going on when the Fed purchases bonds. What happens to interest rates? Okay, so we kind of walked through before, right? Money supply is expanding, right? Because they're taking securities off the bank balance sheets and putting cash in, right? Which is going to go through the money multiplier. So that's increasing the money supply. So if you weren't sure, what the effect on interest rate is, you can quick draw a money market graph, right? So we had money supply, and then we've got money demand here. So what happened to the money supply? Well, we just said it expanded, right? Because the Federal Reserve is putting cash onto the balance sheet of the bank, and then they're able to further lend that out, right? So money supply is increasing. So what happens to interest rates? So if you look through your points here, okay, rates are clearly decreasing, right? So if we know that, all we need to know what direction the price of bonds are going. So if interest rates are decreasing, then price of bonds has to be increasing. So there's a little roundabout logic you have to go through to get to that one. And your explanation should definitely integrate, okay, the fact that interest rates are decreasing due to the increased money supply, then the price of the bonds must be increasing. All right, let's go to part E. Suppose instead of the purchase of bonds, an individual deposits $5,000 in cash into her checking, which is the same as a demand deposit account. What is the immediate effect of the cash deposit on the M1 measure of the money supply? This is no change. And the reason is that both cash and demand deposits are included in M1. So you're really not changing the total amount of M1, the total amount of the money supply. You're just changing the composition, right? It's moving from cash to demand deposits. So any question like that where somebody's depositing or even withdrawing and they ask about M1, right? There's no change to M1 because both those categories are considered to be part of M1. So you're just changing the composition.